On February 28, 1905, in room 120 of the Moana Hotel in Honolulu, a scream rang out that cost $30 million. This was not a cry for help in the usual sense. It was a scream of pure physical terror. On the bed, an elderly woman of 76 years convulsed. Her body arched in a bow so that only her occiput and heels touched the bed. Her jaws were clenched with such force that teeth grinding was audible. Her fingers dug into her palms, leaving bloody marks. Hotel physician Francis Humphreys, who rushed into the room, saw a scene usually encountered only on the fields of brutal battles or in the laboratories of mad chemists. The woman was conscious. Her mind remained crystal clear, locked in a body that no longer obeyed her. She knew what was happening. She knew who did it. A few minutes before the agony began, she asked her companion, faithful Bertha Benner, to give her soda to soothe her stomach. The sip was bitter. 15 minutes later, hell began. The last words she managed to force out through her convulsion-clenched jaws sounded like a verdict on an entire era. This is a terrible death. This woman was Jane Lathrop Stanford, co-founder of Stanford University, widow of a railroad magnate whose fortune, adjusted to modern money, exceeded $1 billion. She was a person who could buy this hotel, the entire island, and half the steamship lines in the Pacific Ocean with a single stroke of the pen. But she died in complete dependence on maids and a random doctor, far from her marble palace in San Francisco, far from her husband's and son's graves. Death came quickly. The diagnosis of Dr. Humphreys and the local coroners was unequivocal and documented: strychnine poisoning. In the wastebasket, they found that very jar of sodium bicarbonate. Later analysis would show that it contained a huge amount of poison. It was murder. A cold-blooded, calculated elimination of the main benefactor of the West's most prestigious educational institution. But what happened next shocks even more than the poisoning itself. As soon as the news of Jane's death reached the mainland, from San Francisco to Hawaii, urgently sailed not a detective, not a prosecutor, and not a relative. It was David Starr Jordan, the first president of Stanford University. A man of science, a man with an impeccable reputation. He crossed the ocean not to find the killer. He arrived to kill Jane Stanford a second time. Jordan hired his own doctor, paid the right people, and forced the rewriting of the death certificate. Strychnine disappeared from the documents. The official version became heart rupture from overeating. The president of the university, which today is associated with Silicon Valley geniuses, high technologies, and the search for truth, personally organized one of the most cynical falsifications in the history of American justice. He turned the victim of a brutal murder into a foolish old woman who simply ate too much at dinner. Why did he do it? Because it wasn't just money at stake. The survival of the university was at stake. Jane Stanford was going to fire Jordan. She held the checkbook from which professors' salaries and campus construction depended. Her death became salvation for the academic elite. The founder became inconvenient. The founder needed to be removed. Today, Stanford is a brand worth more than many countries. Here studied the founders of Google, Hewlett-Packard, and Nike. Strolling through the sunlit campus, students see majestic arches and manicured lawns. They see monuments to the Stanford family. But they don't know that the foundation of this greatness is mixed with poison. If you look at old photos of Jane, you will see a stern woman in a black Victorian dress. Her gaze reads steely will. She survived the death of her only son, survived her husband's death, survived the financial crash that nearly destroyed her family. She stood against the U.S. government, which demanded repayment of her husband's debts. But she could not survive the betrayal of those she considered her new family. This is not just the story of a rich widow. This is the story of how big money breeds big blood. This is the anatomy of a crime that remained unsolved for more than 100 years, until historians raised the archives and matched facts that lay on the surface. We go back to 1824 to understand where these bloody millions came from and how the son of a simple innkeeper turned into a man capable of buying the law. Before Jane Stanford drank the poisoned soda in Honolulu, there was a long way up. A path paved with ties, gold, and broken fates. To understand why a lethal dose of poison ended up in a glass of water, we need to rewind the tape 50 years back. We move from paradise Honolulu to dirty, manure and whiskey-scented Sacramento of the mid-19th century. It was here, among adventurers and failures, that the history of the Stanford dynasty began. Leland Stanford, the future governor of California and U.S. senator, was not born with a silver spoon in his mouth. He was the son of an innkeeper from the state of New York. His first business, a law office in Wisconsin, burned to the ground along with his library and savings. In 1852, he arrived in California penniless. He was part of the same stream of people gripped by the gold rush, but Leland had one critically important difference. While thousands of dreamers waded knee-deep in icy water sifting sand for nuggets, Stanford understood the main axiom of capitalism. During a gold rush, you don't need to look for gold. You need to sell shovels to those who are looking for it. Together with his brothers, he opened a store for prospectors. He sold picks, boots, vinegar, and flour at markups that would give any modern antitrust committee a seizure. These were dirty but honest money. However, the real empire, the one that would later allow his wife to wear necklaces around her neck worth the budget of a small city, was not built on flour trade. It was built on a grand scam called the Transcontinental Railroad. Leland Stanford teamed up with three partners, Collis Huntington, Mark Hopkins, and Charles Crocker. In history textbooks, they are called the Big Four, but in essence, it was an organized crime group legalized by a government contract. Their scheme was brilliantly simple and monstrously cynical. The U.S. government paid them for every mile of track laid. The amount depended on the landscape difficulty, less for plains, more for mountains. Stanford and his partners used their political influence to redraw geological maps. They forced geologists to classify the plain before the Sierra Nevada mountains as foothills in order to receive higher subsidies for hundreds of miles of flat-as-a-table land. To launder this money, they created a shell company, Contract and Finance Company. Stanford, the railroad president, hired Stanford, the contractor, at prices inflated twofold. They transferred money from the government's pocket to their own, leaving shareholders and taxpayers high and dry. But this wealth had another price: human. Stanford, who loved to pontificate about progress, built his railroad on the bones of 12,000 Chinese workers. They were called coolies. They were paid pennies. They were not considered people. When it was necessary to drill tunnels through the granite of the Sierra Nevada, it was precisely the Chinese who were sent to place nitroglycerin. Explosions, collapses, and snow avalanches claimed hundreds of lives. Bodies were often simply dumped into ravines to avoid delaying the schedule. In the company's accounting books, these deaths were not even recorded as losses, because the life of a Chinese worker was cheaper than a mule. At that time, Jane Stanford lived in the shadow of her husband. In those years, she was a model of modesty. She managed the household herself, mended clothes, and saved every cent. She watched as Leland's influence grew, as he became governor of California, using railroad money to buy votes. She was a witness to how he transformed from a shovel seller into an American oligarch. Their marriage was a strong union, cemented by a common goal and common pain. They had no children. 18 years of marriage and silence in the nursery. This waiting for an heir became an obsession that would later play a fatal role. The culmination of the first stage of their lives was May 10, 1869. Promontory Summit, Utah. The meeting of the two railroad branches. Leland Stanford, dressed in an expensive frock coat, was to drive the last golden spike, symbolizing the unification of America. Around stood photographers, officials, and those very workers who survived the hellish labor. Stanford raised the heavy silver hammer, swung, and missed. He hit the tie, not the spike, but the telegrapher sitting nearby still tapped out to the world one word: done. This moment perfectly describes their entire life, a beautiful facade behind which hides clumsy truth, and a telegraph that reports lies to the world. The Stanfords became owners of a fortune that, adjusted to today, would amount to tens of billions of dollars. Now they had everything to start spending. The era of accumulation ended. The era of mad luxury began, which was supposed to drown out the memory of the blood of Chinese workers and the burned office in Wisconsin. After 18 years of barren waiting, when Jane Stanford was already preparing to meet old age in the silence of huge, empty rooms, a miracle happened. In 1868, at the age of 39, what, by the standards of the 19th century, was considered deeply risky, almost senile age for childbirth, she gave birth to a son. Leland DeWitt Stanford, who would later be renamed Leland Stanford Jr., came into the world not just as a child. He was born as a crown prince, as the sole justification for all those crimes and machinations through which his father had passed. From this moment, the life of the Stanford family takes a sharp turn. The era of capital accumulation is replaced by an era of its unrestrained, almost manic demonstration. If earlier Leland Sr. built railroads to earn money, now he began building palaces to show the world who was boss here. Sacramento became too small for them. They needed San Francisco, the city that in the 1870s of the 19th century was turning into the Paris of the Wild West. They chose Nob Hill, the highest hill in the city, from where one could spit on the roofs of the houses of mere mortals. Stanford bought a huge plot of land and began construction of a mansion that was to eclipse everything America had seen before. The construction cost $2 million of that time. If we convert this amount to modern rates, taking into account inflation and labor costs, we get a figure exceeding $60 million. And that's just the walls and foundation. The Stanford's house on Nob Hill was not just a dwelling. It was a fortress of luxury. It was surrounded by a granite wall, like a medieval castle. Inside, there were 50 rooms. The main hall rose 3 stories high, crowned with a glass dome through which amber light fell on the marble floor, inlaid with zodiac signs. The walls were covered with purple velvet brought from France, and silk from that very Asia whose sons died building the railroad of its owner. In the dining room, which could seat 40 guests at once, dishes were served on gold services. The menu of one ordinary dinner could include 12 courses: oysters, turtle soup, saddle of lamb, pheasants in truffles, champagne sorbets. While down below, in the port docks of San Francisco, dockers fought over a piece of stale bread. On Nob Hill, they threw away the leftovers of foie gras that spoiled guests had not finished. But the main jewel in this golden cage was Leland Jr. His parents surrounded him with such dense guardianship, that the boy practically did not interact with the real world. He had no normal childhood. He was not allowed to run through the streets, climb trees, or fight with neighboring boys. His friends were governesses, dance teachers, and, of course, servants. On the third floor of the mansion, they built him a playroom that more resembled an engineering faculty. There was a miniature but fully functioning railroad laid out, a precise copy of his father's empire. The boy could spend hours operating the trains, feeling like a little god of steam power. But he was even more fascinated by collecting. From an early age, Leland Jr. showed a passion for history and archaeology, utterly uncharacteristic of children his age. While other children collected tin soldiers, he collected ancient coins, Egyptian figurines, and fragments of Roman mosaics. His parents encouraged this. They allocated several rooms for his personal museum, proudly showing guests the collection of our little genius. To protect the air from diseases and the bad influences of the city, Stanford bought a huge estate of 8,000 acres south of San Francisco in the Santa Clara Valley. He named it Palo Alto Stock Farm. Today, university campuses and offices of tech giants stand on this site, but back then it was the most advanced horse breeding farm in the world. Leland Sr. was obsessed with horses, just as much as with power. He spent tens of thousands of dollars buying the best trotters. It was right here, on this farm, that he hired photographer Edward Muybridge to prove his theory that a horse during a gallop lifts all four legs off the ground. This experiment, which cost Stanford $50,000, became the precursor to cinematography. For the rich, a whim is the engine of progress. Leland Jr. grew up in this atmosphere of boundless opportunities and total control. He was a tall, awkward teenager, serious beyond his years. He spoke French fluently, knew art better than many museum curators, and could hold polite conversation with senators. But behind the facade of this golden boy hid deep loneliness. He was the only link connecting his aging parents to the future. The entire empire, railroads, lands, steamships, mansions, was all destined for him alone. This was colossal pressure. His father saw in him his own continuation. His mother saw in him the meaning of life. They suffocated him with their love and their expectations. The Stanford family lived in constant motion. They had their own private railroad car, a palace on wheels with a kitchen, bedrooms, and study. They traveled across America as presidents today fly on private jets. But their ambitions were not limited to America. Europe beckoned them with its aristocratic splendor. The Stanfords regularly crossed the Atlantic to buy paintings by old masters at the Louvre, order dresses from the best tailors in Paris, and present their son at the courts of European monarchs. None of them knew that this feast of life was coming to an end, that all these millions invested in marble, velvet, and racehorses would prove useless in the face of simple biology. That fate had already started the countdown for their main treasure, their son. In 1883, the Stanford family set off on their next grand tour of Europe. They planned to spend several years there, enjoying art and society. They brought with them dozens of trunks of outfits, a retinue of servants, and a checkbook with an unlimited limit. They were heading toward their main tragedy, confident in their invulnerability. After all, they were Stanfords, and Stanfords were used to the world bending to them. Money has a smell. For the old aristocracy of New York, for the descendants of Dutch settlers and Pilgrim Fathers, the Stanfords' money smelled of creosote, coal smoke, and the sweat of Chinese workers. In the 1870s, America was divided by an invisible but insurmountable wall. On one side of the barricades stood the old money, the clans of Astors, Vanderbilts, and Roosevelts, who believed that wealth should age for generations, like good wine. On the other side rushed to power the nouveau riche, new people like the Stanfords, whose capitals bubbled like young beer and threatened to blow the lid off the social cauldron. For Jane and Leland Stanfords, conquering the financial Olympus was only half the job. They needed something more than just a bank account with 6 zeros. They needed recognition. They wanted the doors of Fifth Avenue salons to open before them, not out of fear, but out of respect. But the high society of the East Coast held the defense. For Mrs. Astor, the uncrowned queen of New York, Leland Stanford was just a lucky shopkeeper, and Jane, a crude provincial who could not distinguish an oyster fork from a dessert fork. In response to this cold contempt, the Stanfords unleashed a real social war. Their weapon became demonstrative, aggressive luxury. If they were not invited to balls, they held their own receptions on such a scale that ignoring them became impolite. Jane Stanford turned her wardrobe into battle armor. She did not possess the refined beauty of society lionesses. She was a woman of stocky build, with a heavy gaze and stern face. But when she entered the hall, conversations fell silent. She wore so many jewels that contemporaries joked she moved with difficulty under the weight of diamonds. Her collection of jewelry was legendary. Just one 4-piece set with rubies and diamonds was valued at $100,000 of that time. She bought up stones that once belonged to the Spanish Queen Isabella II. This was a direct challenge. If we have no royal blood, we will buy royal stones. At receptions in their Nob Hill mansion or rented palaces in Washington, Jane appeared in dresses of heavy brocade trimmed with pearls, like a Byzantine empress. This was kitsch. This was tastelessness. But it worked. People whispered behind her back, called her vulgar, but they ate her truffles and drank her wine. However, the cruelest front of this war was not between the Stanfords and the Astors, but within the Big Four itself. The business partners who made billions on the railroad hated each other with fierce hatred. Collis Huntington, the brain of their criminal syndicate, despised Leland Stanford. Huntington was an ascetic and cynic who worked 18 hours a day. He considered Stanford a damned old fool and a peacock, whose only merit was the ability to puff out his cheeks before the public. This enmity spilled over into an architectural battle. When Stanford built his palace on Nob Hill, another partner, Mark Hopkins, immediately began building a house next door, trying to make it taller and richer. Charles Crocker went even further. He erected a mansion that literally cast a shadow on the neighbors' houses and surrounded it with a spite fence 12 meters high to block the view of the unwelcome neighbor who refused to sell him the land. This was a millionaire's district where every brick screamed of vanity and mutual dislike. The pinnacle of Leland's social expansion was 1885, when he decided to buy himself a seat in the U.S. Senate. At that time, senators were chosen by state legislatures, not the people. Stanford simply paid. He betrayed his friend and political ally Aaron Sargent, bought up votes, and went to Washington. This enraged Collis Huntington, who dreamed of political influence for himself. The war between them entered an open phase. Huntington began publicly calling Stanford an embezzler, an irony worthy of a Greek tragedy, considering that they stole together. In Washington, the Stanfords rented a huge mansion on K Street. They held lunches where menus were printed on silk ribbons, and each guest was given a gold souvenir. But despite all efforts, Jane remained an outsider in this world of intrigues and nuances. She was too straightforward, too serious, too Western. Loneliness permeates her letters from that period. Behind the shine of chandeliers and the clink of crystal hid emptiness. She had thousands of acquaintances who wanted to ask her husband for money, but almost no friends. The only person for whom this war was waged remained her son, Leland Jr. All these titles, senatorial seats, mansions, and diamonds were intended to create a platform for him. The Stanfords understood that they were the first generation, the dirty generation. Their hands were in grease. But their son was to become a pure aristocrat. They dreamed that he would enter high society not as the son of a railroad man, but as a prince of American industry. It was precisely for this social leap into the stratosphere that they embarked on that fateful trip to Europe. They wanted to present their 15-year-old heir to the courts of the old world, to finally wash away the stigma of upstarts from themselves. They did not yet know that this pursuit of status would lead them to a catastrophe that would devalue all their millions in one night. The social ladder they had so persistently climbed led not to heaven, but straight into the abyss. While the Stanfords waged positional war in Washington and San Francisco, on the other side of the Atlantic, the most cynical Vanity Fair in history was unfolding. This was the era of dollar princesses. American millionaires, rejected by local elites, found a brilliant way to convert their dirty railroad and coal money into impeccable blue blood. They began buying up European aristocrats. The scheme was as simple as a bank check. An impoverished British duke or French count received $1 million dowry to repair the roof of his ancestral castle, and the daughter of an American nouveau riche received a title and coat of arms. This was pure business. No romance, only calculation. Consuelo Vanderbilt wept on her wedding day to the Duke of Marlborough. But her mother didn't care. The deal was closed. The Stanfords had no daughter whom they could profitably exchange for a marquise's title. They had a son, Leland Jr., and the stakes on him were even higher. They did not plan to marry him off or get him married. They took him to Europe to buy him not just a title, but cultural legitimacy. Their grand tour of 1883 resembled not a family vacation, but a military campaign to conquer the old world. The route was grueling. London, Paris, Rome, Vienna, Constantinople. The family moved with royal pomp, sweeping up antiques, paintings, and sculptures along the way. Jane Stanford behaved like a possessed woman. She wanted her son to absorb all the culture of the world at once. Leland Jr. was only 15 years old. He was smart, curious, but physically frail teenager. Parents dragged him through damp museums, cold cathedrals, and endless receptions. They demanded that he be adult, be worthy of the millions that would fall on him. In Constantinople, the capital of the Ottoman Empire, they met with Sultan Abdul Hamid II. The teenager was delighted by the Oriental color. He bought up ancient coins and dreamed of becoming an archaeologist. But it was there, among dusty bazaars and ancient ruins, that an invisible killer had already entered his body. Typhoid bacillus. The disease of dirty water and unsanitary conditions, which makes no distinction between a beggar and an heir to an empire. Symptoms appeared when the family reached Italy. At first, it was attributed to fatigue from travels. Just overexertion, the parents said, continuing to drag their son through galleries. But in Rome, the boy got worse. The Stanfords urgently left for Florence, hoping that the Tuscan air would restore the heir's health. They checked into the best hotel in the city, the Grand Hotel on the banks of the Arno River. In the luxury suite, whose windows overlooked Piazza Ognissanti, the tragedy unfolded that crossed out the meaning of existence of the entire dynasty. Leland Jr. was burning with fever. The temperature rose above 40 degrees. The best doctors in Italy and specialists summoned by telegraph from Paris threw up their hands. At that time, the only remedy for typhoid was considered cooling. Imagine this horror. Parents possessing a fortune capable of buying all of Florence, forced to watch as their only adored son is wrapped in ice sheets. The boy was shaking from chills, delirious, calling for Mom, asking to stop this endless train that was knocking in his head. Jane Stanford spent 3 weeks at his bedside, barely closing her eyes. She prayed to all gods. She offered doctors any money. But death does not accept checks. On March 13, 1884, 2 months before his 16th birthday, Leland Stanford Jr. passed away. His last words were, "Mom, I'm so tired." At that moment, the richest man in California, railroad baron Leland Stanford, turned into an old man. Eyewitnesses recalled that he collapsed into a chair and covered his face with his hands. All their ambitions, all their intrigues, all their gold, everything became dust in 1 second. The arms race in luxury ended in defeat. The heir was gone. There was no one for the empire to pass to. According to legend, the next morning after his son's death, Leland Stanford woke up and said to his wife a phrase that changed American history: "I have no one else to live for." And then, after a long pause, added, "The children of California will be our children." This was a turning point. From the ashes of personal tragedy, an idea began to be born that would outlive them all. But for now, they were just 2 grief-stricken parents in a foreign country, facing the most terrible journey of their lives: to carry the embalmed body of their child across the ocean and the entire continent, back home, to that very marble mausoleum on Nob Hill, which now seemed to them a tomb. Europe, which they so wanted to conquer, took from them the most precious thing, leaving in exchange only cold emptiness and a huge fortune that suddenly became an unbearably heavy burden. When the steamer with Leland Jr.'s body docked on the shores of America, the Stanford family did not return home. They returned to a crypt. Their Nob Hill mansion, which a year ago rang with glasses and laughter, turned into the most expensive mausoleum in the world. The windows were draped with heavy velvet curtains that did not let in the California sun. Mirrors, in which guests' outfits once reflected, were now covered with black crepe. Servants walked the corridors on tiptoe, as if afraid to wake the dead boy. The Stanford's house became the physical embodiment of their grief. It was a huge, oppressive space, 70,000 cubic feet of marble, mahogany, and gold. In the center of this splendor sat 2 broken people. They breakfasted in the dining room designed for 40 people, sitting at opposite ends of a 10-meter table. The silence was broken only by the clink of silverware on porcelain and the ticking of grandfather clocks counting time that had stopped for them. It was precisely in this atmosphere of absolute, ringing emptiness that the idea of the university was born. Leland Stanford decided to spend his fortune not on charity in the usual sense, but on creating a monument. He hired the best landscape architect in America, Frederick Law Olmsted, creator of Central Park in New York. Stanford brought him to his farm in Palo Alto and, circling the dry fields with his cane, said, "Here will be the university." The architecture of Stanford University that we see today is a direct cast of the souls of its founders at that moment. This is not the light, airy Gothic of Oxford or Harvard. This is heavy, squat, Romanesque style. Thick walls of yellow sandstone, endless arches reminiscent of monastic cloisters, red tiles. The campus looks like a fortress protecting knowledge from the outside world. The long galleries were designed so that students could go to lectures without stepping out into the scorching sun or rain, but visually, they created the effect of an endless labyrinth. The heart of this stone labyrinth became the Memorial Church. Jane insisted on its construction. The temple walls were decorated with mosaics brought from Venice, But instead of saints, the features of their deceased son could often be discerned on the stained glass windows. This was a temple not to God, but to Leland Jr. Inside reigned semi-darkness and coolness, smelling of incense and old money. Life inside the estate followed a strict, almost prison-like routine. The staff was huge, more than 40 people just in the main house. But this was an invisible army. Chinese cooks working in basement kitchens had no right to go upstairs. Maids polishing the parquet to a mirror shine were obliged to disappear into wall niches when the owners appeared. Among this staff, the figure of Bertha Benner began to stand out. She was not a simple servant. She was Jane's personal secretary, her shadow, her ears and eyes. Bertha lived in a strange intermediate status, too close to be a servant, but too poor to be an equal. She absorbed the secrets of this house like a sponge absorbs water. She saw how grief transforms the owners. Leland Stanford, once the formidable robber baron, began to age rapidly. His gait became shuffling, his hands trembled. He increasingly retreated into mysticism. In the evenings, in the purple room of the mansion, spiritualist seances were held. The Stanfords hired mediums to talk to their son. Imagine this scene. One of the most influential people in America, a U.S. senator, sits in the darkness, holding hands with charlatans, and cries when he hears a knock on the wall, taking it for a message from Leland Jr. This was the agony of a rational mind. But if Leland was fading, Jane, on the contrary, was hardening. Grief forged a tyrant out of her. She began to control every little thing. She personally checked grocery bills, recounted the table silver, monitored the maid's morality. She became obsessed with the idea of purity and order. It seemed to her that chaos had killed her son, and now she tried to order the world around her with manic meticulousness. The university opened its doors on October 1, 1891. At the opening ceremony, Leland Stanford delivered a speech. His voice was weak. He often faltered. Next to him sat Jane in mourning. Before them stood the first students, children of California. Among them was an orphan from Iowa named Herbert Hoover, the future U.S. president. But the Stanfords looked at them and saw no living people. They saw only projections of their dead boy. This grand project, costing $20 million, more than $500 million in modern money, was built on shaky ground. Stanford's financial empire was cracking at the seams. Mindless spending on construction, maintenance of several estates, and purchase of art objects had depleted reserves. Moreover, the U.S. government launched a lawsuit against the Big Four, demanding repayment of multi-million-dollar debts for the railroad construction. The architecture of power that they had been building for decades turned out to be a facade, behind which hid a financial black hole. The huge halls of their palaces were cold not only because of the marble. They were cold from fear of losing everything. And this fear would soon materialize in an event that would deliver a second, fatal blow to this family. Leland Stanford would not withstand this strain. On June 21, 1893, Leland Stanford's heart stopped. He died in his sleep, in his house in Palo Alto. For the world, it was news of the passing of a great magnate. But for Jane Stanford, it became the beginning of a 10-year nightmare that turned her life into an endless struggle for survival. As soon as her husband's body cooled, the terrible truth emerged. The golden facade of the empire concealed ruins. Leland left behind not only the university, but also a monstrous financial chaos. That same year in America struck the Panic of 1893, the most severe economic crisis. Banks burst, railroads went bankrupt. And at that very moment, The United States government presented the Stanford heirs with a bill for $15 million. These were old debts for the construction of that very transcontinental railroad. The family's accounts were frozen, assets seized. Jane was left alone. She was 65 years old. On her hands was a university that burned through $1,000 a day, and not a cent in cash to pay the electricity bills. Her lawyers, her brother, even the university president, David Starr Jordan, all in one voice told her, "Close the university, declare bankruptcy, save yourself." But they poorly knew Jane Stanford. In this woman, whom everyone considered merely the shadow of her great husband throughout her life, the fury of a berserker awoke. She declared, "I will stop construction. I will sell my horses. I will walk in rags. But the university will not close for a single day." And she kept her word. Jane fired almost all the staff. She tried to sell her famous jewelry in London at Queen Victoria's Jubilee, but the market was oversaturated, and the diamonds had to be returned to the safe. She personally handed out professors' salaries from the crumbs that the court allocated to her for widow's maintenance. It was precisely in these hungry years that the very rot was born that would eventually lead to the murder. Relations between Jane and the university president, David Starr Jordan, turned into a Cold War. Jordan was an ambitious scientist, Darwinist, who believed in eugenics and the superiority of the strong. He expected that after the death of old Leland, power would pass to him, and instead he found himself subordinate to a stubborn authoritarian widow who interfered in every little thing. Jane treated the university not as a temple of science, but as a memorial to her son. She demanded that professors be moral. She forbade drawing nudes in art classes. She fired teachers for inappropriate political views. The culmination was the scandal with Professor Edward Ross. Ross was a star of sociology, students' favorite, but he was a radical. At rallies, he shouted about the threat of Asian immigration and racial suicide. Jane, whose husband built his fortune on the labor of Chinese, considered this a personal insult and vulgarity. She summoned Jordan and issued an ultimatum. "Either you fire Ross, or I fire you." David Starr Jordan was forced to obey. He fired Ross, which caused a revolt among academics across the country. The press branded Stanford as a place where freedom of speech is strangled by the wallet of an old widow. Jordan was humiliated. He hated Jane for making him look like a puppet. In his eyes, she was an ignorant obstacle to progress, a relic of the past that needed to be eliminated for the future of science. The atmosphere in the Stanford's house became poisonous in both the literal and figurative senses. Jane felt that she was surrounded by enemies. She became suspicious. She complained that the servants were spying on her, and she was right. Her faithful companion, Bertha Benner, was playing a double game. Bertha was the eyes and ears of David Starr Jordan inside the house. She reported to the president about every step of the widow, her mood, her plans to rewrite the will. By 1904, Jane won the lawsuit against the government. Money flowed like a river again. But power corrupts, and absolute power in the hands of a lonely old woman drives those around her mad. Jane decided to conduct a purge. She realized that Jordan was leading the university astray. She learned about his intrigues. At the beginning of 1905, she made the decision. David Starr Jordan must be fired. She did not know that she had signed her own death warrant. In the corridors of the campus, in mahogany offices, they were already whispering that the old lady had lost her mind and was putting the entire legacy at risk. Rot had eaten away the foundation. People she paid, people she saved from poverty, now looked at her not as a benefactress, but as a problem. And problems in the world of big money are usually solved radically. In January 1905, Jane drank a glass of Poland Spring mineral water in her San Francisco mansion. The water seemed strangely bitter to her. She immediately induced vomiting, which saved her life. Analysis showed the presence of strychnine. Someone tried to kill her in her own home. Someone who had access to her bedroom. Someone who knew her habits. Jane was horrified. She realized that staying in San Francisco was deadly dangerous. She decided to flee. Flee to where she thought she would be safe, the Hawaiian Islands. She took with her only the most trusted people, including Bertha Benner. She did not know that she was taking her death with her. She was fleeing from the shadow, but the shadow had long been sitting in her suitcase. The point of no return had been passed. The murder mechanism had been set in motion, and it was no longer possible to stop it. Waiting for the command to continue. Honolulu greeted Jane Stanford with a gentle breeze and the fragrance of plumeria flowers. It seemed that here, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, 2,000 miles from foggy San Francisco and its poisonous intrigues, she was finally safe. The Moana Hotel, a snow-white wooden palace in Victorian style, stood right on Waikiki Beach. Jane settled in room 120. The sound of the surf came through the windows, which was supposed to calm her frayed nerves. She sincerely believed that she had escaped. February 28, 1905, began idyllically. It was the last day of her life, but nothing foreshadowed trouble. Jane, in the company of her faithful secretary Bertha Benner and a maid, went on a picnic in the mountains. They admired the views from the Pali lookout point, laughed, discussed plans for returning. Jane felt vigorous. She even said to Bertha, "I think God has forgiven me my sins." In the evening, they returned to the hotel. Jane had a light supper of soup and crackers in her room. She was preparing for bed, following her usual ritual. Due to chronic stomach problems, she took a solution of sodium bicarbonate, ordinary baking soda, every evening. The jar of powder stood on the table. This jar was bought at a local pharmacy, but only 2 people had access to it: Jane herself and Bertha Benner. At 11:15 p.m., Jane asked to prepare her soda. Bertha scooped a spoonful of white powder, stirred it in a glass of water, and handed it to her mistress. Jane took a big sip and immediately froze. The taste was familiar, horrifyingly familiar. The same metallic, unbearably bitter taste that she had felt 6 weeks earlier in San Francisco, before the first poisoning attempt. Jane screamed, "This soda is bitter!" She tried to induce vomiting, as last time, by sticking her fingers in her mouth. Bertha and the maid fussed around, offering warm water, but the mechanism of death was already set in motion. Strychnine is one of the cruelest poisons known to mankind. It does not kill instantly. It turns the last minutes of life into torture comparable to medieval executions. Several minutes later, the convulsions began. Dr. Francis Humphreys, the hotel physician who ran in at the screams, found a scene from a nightmare. Jane Stanford lay on the bed, but her body did not touch the sheets. She arched in a bow, resting only on her occiput and heels. This condition is called opisthotonus in medicine. The back muscles contract with such force that they can break the spine. Jane was fully conscious. She looked at the doctor with eyes widened in horror and pain. She understood everything. She screamed, "My jaws are numbing. This is a terrible death." She knew she had been killed, and she knew that the killer was somewhere nearby, perhaps standing right by the bed and handing a towel. Dr. Humphrey's efforts were futile. He tried to administer bromide and chloral hydrate to relieve the spasms, but Jane's jaws were clenched tight. Strychnine blocks inhibitory neurons in the spinal cord, causing all body muscles to contract simultaneously. It is like an electric shock that does not stop. The woman who owned millions, who built a university and outlived all her men, was dying in a foreign hotel room, writhing in pain until her lungs stopped pumping air due to diaphragm spasm. At 11:30 p.m., Jane Stanford's heart stopped. Everything was over in 15 minutes. The jar of soda remained standing on the table. Later, toxicological analysis would show that it contained a lethal dose of strychnine. Someone had added the poison to the powder after the jar was brought from the pharmacy. Someone who knew that Jane would definitely drink it before bed. But the most terrible thing began immediately after the body was covered with a sheet. Bertha Benner, who had just witnessed the agony of her mistress and benefactress, did not look crushed by grief. She acted strangely calmly, and on the mainland, in the Stanford University campus, the news of the founder's death caused not mourning, but a sigh of relief in the president's office. David Starr Jordan received the telegram in the morning. It stated, in black and white, "Mrs. Stanford died of strychnine poisoning." Any normal person, learning that their employer had been murdered, would demand an investigation. Jordan did the exact opposite. He immediately packed his bags and boarded the first steamer to Honolulu. His goal was not to find the killer. His goal was to destroy the truth. Jordan understood. If the world learned that the university's co-founder had been murdered, and that the trail might lead to his own circle, Stanford's reputation would end. Students would scatter, donors would turn away, the university would close. For Jordan, the honor of the uniform and his own career were more important than justice. While Jane's body lay in the Honolulu morgue, and the coroners prepared an unequivocal conclusion of murder, a man was already sailing to the islands who intended to commit a crime against the truth. The great fall of the House of Stanford had occurred. No living heirs remained. Now the battle began for how exactly history would remember this death, as the tragedy of a martyr, or as the absurd end of a sick old woman. When the steamer Alameda, with David Starr Jordan on board, entered Honolulu Harbor, the outcome of the case was predetermined. The university president stepped ashore not as a pilgrim who came to honor the memory of the founder, but as a general of an occupation army arriving to suppress the uprising of facts. The local police, doctors, and coroners were confident in their rightness. It was murder. They had the body, witness testimonies about the agony, and autopsy results showing the presence of strychnine in vital organs. But they lacked the political weight that Jordan brought with him. The cover-up operation he launched deserves to enter textbooks on black PR. Jordan did not argue with the chemists. He simply hired his own doctor, Dr. Ernest Waterhouse, a local surgeon who, for a solid fee, agreed to look at the situation from the right angle. Jordan publicly stated that Jane Stanford died not from poison, but from her own stupidity and gluttony. He launched into the press a version that the 76-year-old woman died from a heart rupture caused by overeating gingerbread and eclairs. Imagine the cynicism of this lie. To turn the victim of brutal poisoning, dying in terrible agony, into a caricatured old woman who overate sweets. The doctors who conducted the autopsy were furious. Dr. Francis Humphreys and toxicologist Robert Shaw protested, waving test tubes and protocols. They found strychnine not only in the soda jar, but also in Jane's stomach contents. But Jordan used his authority as a world-renowned scientist to crush them. He called them provincial dilettantes whose methods were outdated. "As president of Stanford University, I declare that there is no mystery," he told journalists. And the press, hypnotized by his status, began printing his version. Headlines changed from "Murder of Mrs. Stanford" to "Death from Natural Causes." Jordan removed Jane's body from Hawaii with such haste as if it were contraband. No further investigation followed in San Francisco. The California police, who at that time fed from the hands of corporations, did not even open a case. Jordan convinced everyone that an investigation would cast a shadow on the university, scare away applicants, and destroy the family's legacy. "For the good of science, we must remain silent." That was his message. This was a deal with the devil. Justice was sold for the stability of the endowment. Bertha Benner, the main suspect, the person who twice served the poisoned drink, came out of this story not in handcuffs, but with a check. According to Jane's will, she received $15,000, a sum equivalent to $500,000 modern dollars, and the right to lifetime residence in the house. Jordan not only did not accuse her, he effectively protected her, because her testimony about the natural death was the foundation of his lie. Later, Bertha would write memoirs in which she would portray herself as a guardian angel and Jane as a difficult, sickly woman. This was the killer's last mockery of the victim, to rewrite the story of her life after taking it away. But if the human court could be bribed, the court of nature proved incorruptible. As if in response to this monstrous lie, a year after Jane's death, on April 18, 1906, at 5:12 a.m., San Francisco shuddered. The great earthquake struck the city with the force of 1,000 atomic bombs, and this blow fell remarkably precisely on the Stanford's legacy, as if karma decided to finish what people had started. The mansion on Nob Hill, that very palace with 50 rooms where this story began, was destroyed. Huge chimney stacks collapsed inside the house, breaking through all the floors and flying into the basement. Luxurious halls, where Jane received guests in diamonds, turned into a heap of rubble and dust. What the shocks did not destroy was finished by the fire that engulfed the city. The flames consumed velvet, silk, paintings, and furniture. Of California's greatest house, only smoke-blackened ruins of the foundation remained. In Palo Alto, at the university itself, the destruction was no less symbolic. The memorial church, which Jane built as a mausoleum for her son, was beheaded. The bell tower collapsed straight onto the roof, piercing it through. The famous mosaic on the facade, depicting Christ, shattered into millions of colored fragments. The statue of Louis Agassiz, the famous naturalist, fell from the zoology building facade and stuck headfirst into the concrete, leaving only the legs sticking up in the air. A grotesque monument to the pride of science that David Starr Jordan so exalted. The earthquake erased almost all physical traces of the Stanford's luxurious life. This was the final point in the history of their personal wealth. Now the great sale began. Since there were no direct heirs left, neither son, nor wife, nor husband, all assets passed to the university. But these were assets burdened with debts and ruin. The Board of Trustees began ruthlessly disposing of everything that reminded of the Gilded Age. Jane's personal belongings, her dresses, her antique collections, all this went under the hammer. The most famous part of this sale was the fate of the jewelry fund. Those very rubies, emeralds, and diamonds that Jane was so proud of, and with which she tried to buy the respect of the aristocracy, were sold. But there is bitter irony in this. The money from the sale of her vain jewels went to create the book fund of the university library. Diamonds turned into books. What served one woman's ego began to serve the knowledge of thousands of students. The palace in Sacramento was handed over to the Catholic Church and became an orphanage. The farm in Palo Alto was built over with laboratories. The private railroad car, in which they traveled half the world, rotted on sidings. Just a few years after Jane's death, nothing material remained of the Stanford family's greatness, except the name on the campus gates. This was the end of the dynasty. There was no one left who could bring flowers to their graves simply because they loved them, rather than because they were paid a salary by them. The family mausoleum in the University Arboretum, where Leland Sr., Jane, and Leland Jr. now rested, became a strange place. Students walked past it to parties without even thinking about the Shakespearean tragedy lying under those slabs. David Starr Jordan won. He erased the memory of Jane as a co-founder, turning her into the university's honorary grandma, a bit eccentric and hindering progress. He ruled the university for many more years, promoting his eugenics ideas. But the mystery of room 120 in the Moana Hotel hung over him like a sword of Damocles. The coroner's documents from Hawaii did not disappear. They lay in the archives, gathered dust, and waited for their hour. They waited 100 years until the new century would ask old questions. The Stanford family paid the full price for their success. They gave everything: the son to illness, the husband to stress, the wife to the murderer, and the house to the earthquake. Their millions dissolved into concrete and books. This was the mathematics of the curse. 0 living heirs, $1 billion in stone, and one unsolved crime. But history, as is known, does not tolerate emptiness. Even after a century, the echo of this shot, or more precisely, this sip of soda, continues to resound, reminding us that behind every great fortune lies a crime. Today, if you arrive in the heart of Silicon Valley, you will find yourself in the center of the world invented by dreamers. Here, in Palo Alto, the air vibrates with ambition. Driverless cars drive by. In coffee shops, startup founders discuss investment rounds worth millions of dollars. And across perfectly manicured lawns walk future creators of new Googles and iPhones. All this splendor is Stanford University, a brand that has become synonymous with success, intelligence, and boundless opportunities. But if you go a bit deeper, into the shady part of the campus, where old oaks grow, you will find the Stanford Mausoleum, a small building in the Egyptian style, guarded by sphinxes. It is quiet there. Tourists rarely reach here. It is precisely here that Leland, Jane, and their son lie. This is the only place on Earth where the family finally reunited. And this place is the point of absolute zero. This contains the main irony of the dynasty's fate. Look at other giants of the Gilded Age. The Rockefeller family still influences world politics and finance. Vanderbilt descendants remain part of the American elite. It's enough to turn on the TV and watch the famous journalist Anderson Cooper, son of Gloria Vanderbilt, to see the living face of this dynasty. They have great-grandchildren, great-great-grandchildren, family Christmas gatherings. The Stanfords have no one, not a single direct descendant, not a drop of blood in living people. Their biological line was cut off at the moment when the 15-year-old boy closed his eyes in Florence. All their billions, all their palaces, all their crimes and feats could not buy them the main thing: continuation of the line. They remained in history, but disappeared as a biological species. However, the mystery of Jane Stanford's death did not disappear. It waited for its hour for more than a century. Justice, which David Starr Jordan killed, was resurrected thanks to modern technologies and the stubbornness of historians. In 2022, Professor Richard White's book, Who Killed Jane Stanford, was published. The historian did what the police did not want to do in 1905. He dug up the archives, compared testimonies, and conducted a modern analysis of the symptoms. History's verdict is final. It was murder. And David Starr Jordan was an accomplice to the crime, not as the poisoner, but as the man who let the killer go to save the institution's reputation. But karma is patient. In the 21st century, Jordan's name, which for decades adorned the main campus buildings, was erased. He was removed from the facades not only because he was a eugenicist who believed in racial purity, but also because the truth about his betrayal of the founder finally became public knowledge. The man who tried to rewrite history was ultimately struck from it. Today's Stanford is a paradox. It is a monument to parental love built on bloody money. Every student receiving a diploma here is effectively an adopted child of Jane and Leland. In his famous speech, Steve Jobs, standing on the podium of this university, said, "Stay hungry, stay foolish." He did not know that these words perfectly describe the lives of the founders. Leland was hungry for money. Jane was foolish in her fight for her son's memory. What remains of their personal belongings? Almost nothing. In the University Museum, in the Cantor Arts Center, the very golden spike is kept, which Leland never managed to drive into the tie. There also hang portraits of Jane in her royal outfits. But if you look closely at her eyes in these paintings, you will see not triumph, but deep, frozen anxiety. It was as if she knew that she would have to pay for everything. America's Gilded Age taught us that the shine of gold often hides rot. The story of the Stanfords is a perfect illustration of the price of the American dream. They built a railroad connecting the oceans, but lost connection with each other. They built a university that changes the world, but died in loneliness and fear. Jane Stanford was killed twice. The first time, with strychnine in room 120 of the Moana Hotel. The second time, with a lie that turned her tragedy into a farce. But today, we restore her dignity as a victim. She was not a crazy old woman. She was a mother who defended her home until her last breath. And although her killer, Bertha Benner, died in her bed a rich woman, and David Starr Jordan died in honor, the last word remained with Jane. Because the campus stands. Because every year, thousands of young people pass through those very arches that she approved on the blueprints. Her money, purified by time and education, works for the future. This is true alchemy. To turn the lead of a bullet and the bitterness of poison into pure gold of knowledge.